I'm Russell Galanti. I'm an extension agent for University of Hawaii Tropical Plant and Soil Sciences Department, if you don't know me. I am the ornamental extension agent for currently Hawaii Island, East Hawaii specifically, and Oahu Island. I'm doing a project with Tessie Amore, James Keach, and Hannah Lutgen on testing eucalyptus species for cut foliage production. Why are we doing this? Well, if you didn't know, the import of Myrtaceae plants was banned. I believe it was 2018 was the ban. They did so because eucalyptus is a host to several fungal pathogens that are also fungal pathogens on ohia. It's not necessarily, we're not necessarily worried about rapid ohia death, but we are worried about ohia rust. We already have ohia rust in the state, so growing eucalyptus in the state isn't necessarily going to be a problem. What we're trying to avoid is the importation of new fungal species that might be more virulent than the current myrtle rust that we have. It's called myrtle rust, ohia rust, guava rust. So we're trying to reduce the introduction of new fungi. So we've got a high demand for eucalyptus because it's used in almost every wedding celebration. And outside of wedding celebrations, it's used often in cut foliage and cut flower arrangements. But we imported almost all of the cut foliage eucalyptus that we were using in the florist industry. So right now we're trying to ramp up production from 2018. One of the issues is we don't exactly know how to grow eucalyptus. So we're trying to figure that out with this. So first thing we did in 2019, we did a survey to determine who was buying what and what species we should try to grow. These were the responses from that survey. And we got a lot of common names. This whole eucalyptus common name scenario is a good example of why you should stick to Latin names when talking about plants. Number one purchased in that survey was seeded eucalyptus. To the best of our knowledge, that's Eucalyptus polyanthemos. Next up is silver dollar, which to the best of our knowledge is Cinnaria. And then baby blue and where is it? Gunnii take third and fourth. So we decided we were going to grow 4 species of eucalyptus. These were the 4 species that we were deciding to grow. We also asked how much they were buying it for. And we're specifically talking about florists and anybody who's a purchaser of eucalyptus, so it could also be wholesalers. It was between $5 and $20 a bunch, and this was both pre-ban prices and after ban prices, because the survey was done in 2019. It was as high as $100 a bunch and as low as $1.75 a bunch. Now, the unit of what a bunch is depends. A lot of people did not say what the unit was, so it was either in poundage, in ounce weight, or it was by the stem count. It also depends on how long the stems are. So this didn't give us a lot of information other than the average price was $9.59 a bunch in the 2019 survey. So what we did was we decided to plant eucalyptus across the state. For the talk I'm discussing, I'm going to discuss the YK planting at YK Research Station and the Pearl City planting at Leeward Community College. So 5 plants were installed of 4 varieties each of these cut foliage eucalyptus varieties. The first one that I want to talk about is baby blue. You can see what it looks like here. So if you use common names normally and you don't know what we were talking about, this is what baby blue looks like. It's pretty easy to name this plant because it's almost always called baby blue. Although sometimes smaller leaf Cinnarias can also be called baby blue, or they could have mix-ups with Cinnaria and baby blue. Gunnii are also called the silver drop eucalyptus. So this was another preferred eucalyptus for florists. You can see it's more upright in its growth habit, at least at YK Research Station. Eucalyptus polyanthemos. So this is what they call seeded eucalyptus. Often it's sold when it's actually going to seed. So in this picture, what you're looking at, we don't have seeds yet because the plants haven't produced. And then Eucalyptus cinnaria, almost always called silver dollar. So for the Waikea planting, we planted in August of 2021. And this was up at Waiakea Research Station, so it's just up the street from us at about 600-foot elevation. The average annual rainfall is 170 inches. Average minimum temperatures are generally around 63 degrees Fahrenheit up to 79 degrees Fahrenheit for the average high temperature in Fahrenheit. So we planted these plants in compost soil amendment in reclaimed cinder beds. So if you have been up to Waiakea Research Station, there were some anthurium beds that were slightly raised with pretty much all cinder. We planted into those beds because we were looking for a location with really good drainage, because we assumed the eucalyptus would want drainage up at Waiakea. And so far we've taken data. I'm going to show the data from September 2021 to July 2022. You're going to be looking at the top left, number of branches, average number of branches per eucalyptus variety. Looking over at the top right, average width for the plants, so how wide they are between all the plants. Average yield on the bottom left, and average height on the bottom right. So what we're looking at here, we can take a look at April 2022. That's going to be our first real harvest. So you can see after April 2022, the branches decreased, but the eucalyptus variety with the most production in terms of number of branches was Eucalyptus cinerea with 64 branches on average per plant, followed up by Polyanthemos, then Gunnii, and Baby Blue. You're going to see pretty similar patterns here with Eucalyptus Polyanthemos and cinerea being the most productive and Eucalyptus Gunnii being normally the least productive and Baby Blue somewhere in between. So that's expressed in the average width over here with both cinerea and Polyanthemos being somewhat the same width, not the same height though. One thing that set the data off from the rest of the pattern in the average height was one of the Eucalyptus Gunnii species was very tall, and it's that one right there. But this was not necessarily average for all of the plants. Most of the other plants were pretty short. And then looking at average yield, we're getting an idea of what sort of yield we're going to get out of these plants, at least within the first year. So you can see we planted earlier in 2021. It was August 2021, and our first harvest was December. So these plants were growing very quickly. They were about a year old when we put them into the ground in tree pots. So they were just past a year old, about a year and 6 months old or 5 months old at the point that we started harvesting. And really we harvested this time because we were trying to shape the plants. But our first real harvest was in April of 2022. And our average yield for cinerea was 42 saleable stems, and that's any stem that's 12 inches or more with no defects. It doesn't have any issues with the leaves. It's completely saleable. For Polyanthemos, 36 stems on average per plant, and then Gunnii you can see really low, 16 stems on average, and then back up to 36 stems for Baby Blue. And to give you an idea of what that yield looked like, just in a visual form, this is everything we harvest from that April 2022 harvest. Average plant health index. So we also looked at subjective plant health. And you can see from this graph which plants were pretty much healthy from the get-go were Polyanthemos and cinerea. Baby Blue was a little bit behind, and Gunnii looked really bad. You can see Polyanthemos and cinerea dropped in average plant health index from 5 to 4. It was on a scale from 0 to 5. In July of 2022, we started to see some fungal pathogens, and you can see that image down there on the bottom right on the Polyanthemos. The Baby Blue, we decreased the plant health index for reasons such as the top right. We started to have fungal root rot and some canker formation and dieback of the stems. And Gunnii generally stayed very poor health throughout at least the current study because of what we think is Chinese rose beetle damage. You can see the picture on the left-hand side. there's pretty indicative Chinese rose beetle damage. We haven't gone out at night to check, but we're assuming that's what it is for now. So initial assessments from this trial, remember it was planted in August 21, so we're just coming up on 1 year now. All the varieties can be grown at around the 600-foot elevation in and around Hilo in very well-drained soils at least, like the cinder soils that we're growing these plants in. Cinnaria performed the best under these conditions for this first year. Gunnii performed the worst, and it had the highest mortality rate. So we had 60% mortality in the Gunnii, and we replanted it twice and had the same mortality rate. For 20 plants, on average, we did about 2 weeks of work biweekly. So we haven't done an economic analysis of what it takes and what the yield is from these plants because it's just too early to tell. But so far, in terms of labor, we only put about two hours every 2 weeks into the project for 20 plants. So I'm also doing this trial in Pearl City. It's set up just the same. We started this a little bit later because it's part of a different grant. So Glenn isn't here, but I would say thank you to Glenn for specifically the there you are, for the Waiakea planting because Hawaii County Research and Development funded that project. It's still going pretty strong. And then we got a grant as a whole statewide team through Hawaii Department of Agriculture, thanks to HFNA. For their specialty crop block grant. So I installed this plot in November of 2021 at Leeward Community College. They agreed to be collaborators in Pearl City. So if you don't know where that is, it's where this plot is specifically. It's about 20-foot elevation. It's just above sea level. Average rainfall is 24 inches, so we're looking at a big difference between Waiakea and Pearl City. Temperatures are a little bit higher at 67 and 83 degrees min and max, respectively. We planted it into Waipahu series silty clay soil, so that's also a really big difference. It's a heavy clay soil there. Even though it's dry, if they do get rained on or if they do get consistent irrigation, the soil can become waterlogged. And just like with Waiakea, we fertilize every 180 days with NutriCoat 13-11-11. And this is what the plot looked like. I get really cute rental cars every time I go to Oahu, so I'm waiting until I get the exact car again. That would be really cool. And on the bottom right, I just want to thank Daniela Elliott and her students for helping me install the plot, and they're also helping take some of the data collection. So you're looking at the same thing here. I think height and width might be switched there. But average number of branches per plant, average height, average yield, and average width. We've only taken one harvest data collection so far. The big difference here is Polyanthemos is by far the most productive plant from an average branch perspective and from an average yield perspective. And you can see Cinnaria, even though it's got similar number of average branches compared to the other plants, it's less so than at Waiakea, and it had no yield of saleable plant material. And I'll show you why in a few slides. Average height and average width, we'll move on from those, not too important. Average health index. The major consideration here is that Cinnaria is doing very poorly at Pearl City. And I will show you a few slides of what the plants look like. And once we get to Cinnaria, we'll talk about the most important results. So Polyanthemos right here, you can see that Polyanthemos is doing about as well as it was in Pearl City. It doesn't have any problems in the hotter, drier conditions or in this soil or with more solar radiation due to less cloud coverage. There are clouds in that picture, but ignore them. That was very rare. Eucalyptus gunnii, it's doing about as well as it was doing in Waiakea, but its mortality is much lower. It only had 20% mortality. Only one plant died so far. And what we're looking at here is silver dollar. If we had the lights out, we'd probably be able to see the leaves a little bit better. They're all scorched and they're all yellowed. So typically the Eucalyptus Cinnaria is a very nice silvery glaucal coating. And in Pearl City, it does not produce that. It looks chlorotic and sunburnt. And so any of these leaves, even though we pruned them and collected them as harvest data, we didn't use any of them because they're unsaleable. Baby blue is almost the same as Cinerea in terms of how it changed color. It's slightly less silvery in Pearl City than it is in YK, at least for my plots. But it's at least silvery enough that it was saleable. So initial assessments, currently baby blue, gunny eye, and polyanthemos are known to be able to grow at sea level at the Pearl City plot, 20 degrees, 20-foot elevation. Eucalyptus cinerea has struggled in these conditions. It might be the plot. It would be interesting to try it again at another low elevation site to see if it was just this location. I wouldn't necessarily say cinerea can't be grown at sea level, but right now, at least at this site, it's not growing very well. For 20 plants, we did 1 hour biweekly work and maintenance for harvest and maintenance. And eucalyptus gunny eye is also susceptible to, I should put in parentheses, Chinese rose beetle at the LSCC plot, because that's what we assume it is. But right now, that's the only plant that's being affected by an insect pest. I want to thank HDOA, Hawaii County R&D, HFNA, also Tessie, James, Hannah, YK Research Station, Leeward Community College, and my student help, Brianna Ninomoto. I think we'll save the questions until all three of us have given a talk.
Hey everyone, so I know I've met a lot of you all before. I'm James Keach. I'm basically the counterpart to Russell over on Kauai, the ornamental extension agent there, as well as the master gardener coordinator. I'm gonna give you all a little bit of an update based on the same projects that Russell was talking about. Ours started a little bit later, but roughly similar findings and a few different things that we noticed as well. One thing that I saw, there's several eucalyptus trees on the drive up to the research station, and over the course of the past year or two, there's been more and more signs added in front of them saying, do not cut, private property, all these other things. And it seems to be related, like Russell was saying, with the Myrtaceae ban. There's not a lot of growers growing eucalyptus locally, and so these beautiful trees right on the side of the road keep getting scalped, basically, by folks driving by. So I'm hopeful we can take some pressure off of this homeowner and start producing some locally instead. All of the three that I grew were from seed. We didn't have polyanthemos seed. This was seed we'd brought in before the Myrtaceae ban, and so we wanted to see how it grew. Each of them came with different kinds of suggestions for how to germinate. There was a cold treatment. There was one that I think had a bleach soak, several other things. We ended up just sowing all of these on the soil surface with the light dusting of propagation mix on top of them. What you can see is that baby blue does pretty well, but again, Cinerea seems to do a little bit better. They grew up relatively well in these longer tubes. These were kind of like shorter than dibble tubes. And then we transferred them to 1-gallon pots before putting them into the field. And again, as Russell said, it was a little bit less than a year from growing them in pots to getting into the ground. The field layout, I wanted to control for edge effects a little bit. I was reading up on some of the commercial nurseries for this in Australia and other locations, and they do incredibly close spacing. I think the smallest I saw was 3-foot spacing between the trees, which we would never be able to maintain. We have 2 ag techs for 260 acres. So we did 6-foot spacing. We put the plants in and then looked at them a little bit with the border of extra seedlings. We have lost a few plants. Those are the ones with the strikeout through them. And I'll get into what we're seeing with those in a little bit as well. But also just kind of a side-by-side comparison of what we're looking at growth habit-wise. So you can see the baby blue tends to be pretty tall, but sparser branching than the silver dollar. Silver dollar is roughly the same height as baby blue, maybe a little bit shorter. And then the silver drop is the shortest of all of them. And you can barely see it because of the Chinese rose beetle damage. I'll get to that in a few slides as well. Current data, so we haven't done our harvest yet. Our plants are just about at the point that we're harvesting them, but we have been taking data on plant dimensions and also looking at branch length. I wanted to make sure that in addition to kind of the general size, that we would have ones that we knew were about the right length for florists to use, and then also ones that were marketable sized and had like different degrees of health. So what we see, again, kind of mirroring Russell's results, is that the Cinnaria, or the silver dollar, seems to be doing pretty well. It's a little bit shorter than the baby blue, but otherwise it has way more marketable size branches. And then there also has longer branches. And growth habit-wise, you can see I had to stitch it together a little bit because there's no with all three of them. But you can see, again, very similar. Baby blue over on the right. Sorry, the text got messed up when we converted. Silver dollar in the center, and then silver drop on the left. So similar between the baby blue and the silver dollar, but just a lot more branches on the silver dollar. We did notice differences in rose beetle damage as well, and I'll show some kind of close-ups of that in another slide, but huge amounts of rose beetle damage on the silver drop, or gunnii. We assessed it roughly as amount of the leaf area that was decreased. And what we noticed was that it was mostly restricted to gunnii, but we did start seeing it on Cinnaria and pulverulenta, but mostly on the plants that were closest to the gunnii. And we would only see like a few leaves affected that way. So it seems like it's almost a proximity effect, that those are the ones that are getting the rose beetle damage. We also had a few off types, and those are all in the border rows, except I think one that stayed in the gunnii. We're taking data on those separately. They have different leaf shape, different colors, and you can see some decent performance metrics. Also, even the gunnii off types that look like gunnii seem to have reduced rose beetle damage compared to the more standard shape. So these are the off types I was talking about. Oh, and it looks like it got a little jammed up here too. All cuttings from all of these plants are outside, and so if you want to take a look at what the actual branches look like, packed into a suitcase, not into a box, so imagine some sort of like travel damage that way. But you can start to see a little bit how they look. The off types mostly kind of a greenish color compared to that kind of glaucal blue that Russell was mentioning, and also noticeably pointed leaves compared to the standard ones of the species. We did see, I mentioned in gunnii that we saw kind of one that looks a lot like gunnii, but still has like a slightly different growth habit and way less rose beetle damage. So on the far right there, there's kind of a gunnii, and again, it sort of fades into the background just because so much of the canopy is decreased. We see a like really tall off type on the left, and in the middle, there's something that looks sort of in between. I'm not a eucalyptus taxonomist, so I don't know if this was cross-pollination, if this is natural variation within the species. But again, we're taking data on them separately so we can get better averages and seeing if there might be some other advantages to them. Rose beetle damage, it's really hard to get a good picture. I need to get a good background, but you can look at the branches outside again. It's just almost all of the gunnii, the leaves are defoliated. We've looked again, and we see some on the Cinnaria, very, very little on the pulverulenta, and mostly the plants that are closest to gunnii. So we're guessing it's just sort of a proximity effect. But it is something we're watching out for in case they develop kind of a stronger hunger for these other species. Talking with one of my colleagues, they were kind of handling the branches as I was packing them, and their comment, and we haven't quantified this at all, is that the Cinnaria seems to have a stronger kind of eucalyptus fragrance. And we were wondering if that might also be associated with some of this like decreased feeding behavior that it sort of disincentivizes. So plenty of research questions to kind of address. Other pests and diseases, where part of this trial was to kind of assess what the challenges would be, and we found a few challenges so far. We have a few that have just sort of developed what we think is a quick root rot, turned completely black and died. Fortunately, so far, all of these have been in the border rows, and so we've been able to kind of pull them out and stick something else in there, hopefully not affect the plantings. We are starting to see kind of this mottling on some of the plants, and again, this was also in a border row plant. I haven't had a chance to take it under the microscope. I just saw it yesterday. So I'm curious when I get back to see if there's anything growing on it or if it's just kind of a secondary infection and maybe a root rot that's kind of weakening the plant. We also had this one plant within the Pulverulenta that at first I thought was an off-type. It has really small leaves and kind of a different growth habit. But on closer inspection, there looked to be a little bit of damage. And so we think it might be some feeding by either wild pigs or potentially nene. We've had both of those eat things in the field before. But we're keeping an eye on it and seeing if it kind of grows out of it and if we can get a better idea that way. But yeah, so far, some good or not so good information on things that might be affecting the planting. And with that, I think I'll leave it to thanking the folks involved, thanking HFNA, thanking Tessie and the rest of the folks on the grant, Hannah and Russell, and then the folks at the old habits die hard, at the Wailua Research Station, our ag techs Michael and Lou for helping me plant it, and then our team of volunteers who have helped us keep it going. We've also, I didn't get any close-up photos of it, but we're hoping to do this as a longer-term planting. So we have been planting perennial peanut around the base of the trees. For one thing, to start smothering out some of the weeds, but also potentially as a little bit of a benefit from nitrogen fixing. And they went in and planted, I think, 160 perennial peanut plugs among all the trees. So we're hopeful we can get some interesting data from that as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Hello everyone, my name is Hannah. I'm the Ornamental Extension Agent in Maui. I'd first like to thank HFNA for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. And today I just wanted to give you a brief update about eucalyptus here in Maui. So I want to talk about the germination trial and then the field trials. So basically we seeded the Eucalyptus Baby Blue, the Eucalyptus Cinerea Silver Dollar, and Eucalyptus Silver Drop in October. And the best germination was actually the Cinerea. And by the way, I germinated all these seeds up in Kula in small flats that you can see right here in the pictures. Oops. The second best germination rate was actually Baby Blue. And the third was the Silver Dollar, the Silver Drop, Gunyai. So here you can see actually in May, I think due to the cool weather in Kula, the plants grew very slowly. So if you are able to get seeds, you may want to germinate this at a lower elevation, somewhere a little bit warmer, especially if you're on a time crunch. But we did notice that these we transplanted from the trays into dibble tubes in May, June, and August. And now you can see these pictures are actually taken yesterday. So they're growing, they're happy and healthy. We actually put these in cocoa peat. Sure. Gotta stay away. Stay away. Got it. Can you hear me better?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So we did transplant these into cocoa peat with perlite, and also I used a 612 organic fertilizer. So we are taking care of them. They're growing a little bit faster now that it's warmer. Okay, on to the eucalyptus trial. So we planted 4 Gunyai, the Silver Drop, 4 Polyanthemos seeded, and unfortunately due to spacing and plant limitations, I was only able to plant 1 Baby Blue and 1 Silver Dollar in Kula at about 2,800 feet elevation. This is in a nice loamy soil, so it's well drained, very airy, and we drip irrigate 7 to 9 minutes each day, and we adjust as needed based on sunlight and rainfall. So now I want to go into a little bit of the average data we collected. So you can see Eucalyptus polyanthemos, so the seeded, has the greatest height compared to Eucalyptus cinerea, and Eucalyptus Gunyai were the worst, they were the shortest. So for the eucalyptus width, which is interesting to hear all the differences in the climate types across the state, but the gunnii, the pulverenta, which is the baby blue, is actually the widest. It's growing very leggy. It has it's very lateral and upright. It has that nice glaucal blue color. And the polyanthemos and the baby blue are by far doing the best. Again, this is a high elevation site and hot and dry with cool nights. So this is the eucalyptus health subjective rating. But you can see actually again the polyanthemos, so the seeded eucalyptus, and the Eucalyptus pulverenta, which by the way we only have one, so take that into consideration, have the best health. They had the least amount of what we think is Chinese rose beetle damage and the least amount of diseases. And anecdotally, we observed that these two, the the polyanthemos and the pulverenta, the baby blue, seem to have the strongest eucalyptus oil odor. And maybe that is helping reduce insect damage or herbivory. And you can see the worst is the Eucalyptus cinerea at this site, as well as gunnii. So we recently collected harvest data. So the only plants that we were able to harvest at this time was the Eucalyptus baby blue, which you can see right here, and also the polyanthemos. The other two plants were not ready. They were growing very slowly. They weren't quite ready to take harvest data yet, but you can see that the baby blue had all these nice lateral branches, and we were able to collect multiple branches from that plant. And then the polyanthemos, we were able to collect harvest from 3 of the 4 plants. Okay, so in summary, in Kula, Eucalyptus polyanthemos, which is the seeded, and the Eucalyptus baby blue is doing the best. It's performing the best. It has the least amount of insect damage, the least amount of fungal symptoms, what we think could be possibly fungal pest symptoms. It also had the fastest growth rate, and I noticed anecdotally that it had the strongest scent. I do look forward to, once our seedlings are ready to transplant into the field, to repeat these trials, especially planting more Eucalyptus cinerea and more Eucalyptus gunnii. Here are some pictures of the eucalyptus pest damage. You can see this is the Eucalyptus gunnii on the far right. You can see all this pest damage, which is, in my opinion, reducing the growth. And then these 2 pictures are actually pictures from a cooperator grower that he sent me in the field that he was having of his mature plants in lower Kula. Okay, so future objectives. We are ready to disseminate a eucalyptus survey to gather more feedback, so please stay tuned for that. And we will be having eucalyptus field days on, I think, each of the islands. So I'd just like to thank everyone, Tessie, Russell, Joanna, James, Hifna, Judy, Eric, for all your support, and also the Kula Ag Techs that helped me plant and do the transplanting in the field trials. Any questions?
I thought it was very interesting presentation, and interesting how, it's more of a comment, how the rose beetle seems to be all on gunnii. Irrespective of climate and island, do you think that as it grows older, you have less of a rose beetle if you're able to have some sort of like protective barrier? Or did gunnii also not produce well in Waikea? Was that the same one that didn't produce well in Waikea? Right?
Yeah, I also had a lot of root rot in Waikea for the gunnii, but I did notice the one healthy plant has a lot less rose beetle as it matured. But I'm not recommending it right now just because mortality is so high from root rots.
Felt the same thing, I think. You know, like I said, the ones that look like Gunnii but are off-type seem to be doing a little bit better and growing well, but at this point, just so much of the leaf area has been reduced by rose beetle. I'm not sure how much larger they're going to get. And I think in the border rows, we're seeing a lot more death of the Gunnii than we're seeing of the other species as well. So I hope we can get them large enough to take some better data, but we'll see.
Did you think yours was stressed or had any rot too, the Gunnii, or no? They seem otherwise fine.
We've seen at least, I think, 2 or 3 Gunnii, and then it's been other species as well. Our soil, I forgot to mention, is also pretty clayey. We did amend it a little bit. We put fertilizer in also when we were planting, but we also have really bad cylindrocladium infestation across the station, and so we're wondering if that might also be playing a role with some of the plant health. I know it's wiped out some other things we put in.
Since these plants are native to Australia, have you looked at the background of where they came from and what their conditions are that they were originally native to?
So the question was if we looked at the conditions where they're native to in Australia. I have to say I didn't look up exactly their conditions in Australia, but I did look up several growing guides from Australia from growers there. They varied quite a bit in things. I think, like I was mentioning, there were ones that had as little as 2 to 3 feet between trees, all the way to, I think, about 18 feet. Variation as well in what they were suggesting for germination. Growth beyond that, I'm trying to think offhand. I didn't see a good comparison of the species that we were working with. There were some that had 1 or 2, but there were rarely all 3 of the ones I had, and then I didn't see one that had like polyanthemos as well with it. But I think it's a great idea, you know, that we could perhaps avoid some future problems with these as we start to expand our project a little bit, hopefully.
And secondly, these have been grown in California for a long time. Is there any literature out of California that you can refer to?
At least one of the references we looked at was also out of California. And actually, CTAHR published a guide to growing eucalyptus, not ornamental eucalyptus, but I think eucalyptus for pulp, basically. It was, however, published in 1911, so we're hoping we can update that a little bit. And we're not sure, you know, with new pests and diseases, how that might have affected things as well. But yeah, I think it would be a great thing to investigate. I should also say, I believe, at least for the 3 that I looked at, we got their plant pono assessments done. So these are low weed risk eucalyptus as well. Yeah, just always something to bring up when talking about new ornamentals.
So if so have we seen any Ohia rust on the eucalyptus in Waikea? I haven't seen what resembles Ohia rust yet, but I haven't gotten any of the fungal pathogen symptoms tested yet. So I'm going to move on to testing fungal pathogens probably throughout the next year, now that I've got some extra funds for doing testing. And so we'll see if it's there. Yeah, and there's other Myrtaceae plants right up against Waikea Research Station. So if they will infect these eucalyptus, they'll probably do it because I'm assuming we have it up in the paper barks. Yeah. Yeah. So luckily, all these plants were from Hawaii, right? We didn't bring any in. So the idea is that if they had Ohia rust or the myrtle rust, they would have already had only what was in Hawaii already. And we're assuming because it spreads to so many different plant species, strawberry guava, for example, it's not like the small increase in eucalyptus production across the state is going to create this huge increase in the spread of Ohia rust.
I will say for the Wailua research station, we have noticed Ohia rust on Ohia seedlings that the Kauai Invasive Species Council was growing up. It was not really close to the area that the eucalyptus is, but it's not that far either. It was to the point where they started having to do treatments because it was affecting so many of the seedlings. But I haven't seen those same sort of like pustules or anything on the eucalyptus yet. We do have tons of strawberry guava as well, so I assume there's a pretty good inoculum source.